start the recording since it looks like everything is working. And okay, so welcome to the last lecture. Today we're going to talk about, it's kind of a really broad talk, but we're trying to fit, kind of hit main concepts in information curation and retrieval from digital libraries, sort of concentrating on use of the medical literature, both for clinicians in the clinical environment for clinical decision making, as well as for researchers in starting a program of research. So in reflection of how broad the topic is, there's a bunch of learning objectives. So we're going to hit literature synthesis, evidence-based medicine, and then literature synthesis and knowledge generation. We're going to talk a little bit about PICO, how clinicians are taught to formulate questions that they might want to, where they might want to interrogate the medical literature. We're going to talk about sort of different article types in the biomedical literature. And I heard a ding, so let me go check that. Oh, can't see slides. Michael, thank you. That was a user problem, Michael. There we go. Okay. Oh, I heard another ding. Hopefully that was just Michael saying that he can now see the slides. Let me double check just to make sure. Yep. Okay, he can see them now. Okay. So after we talk about PICO questions and question components, we're going to talk about sort of different article types and different levels of information in the literature. We're going to talk about National Library of Medicine and Medline indexing and how journals get into Medline. Your last lab, it's not a real lab, it's a, you have to go to MESH and find the terms to index your poster. If you have already printed your poster, just put them on a Post-it note, it is fine. Okay, so do not reprint anything. Write them on there with a Sharpie or put them on there in a Post-it note. If you guys want to play with the MESH browser, we can find the MESH browser and show you how to do that. The next thing we're going to talk about, the current research sort of climate with respect to open access, discoverability of resources, and research reproducibility. We're going to talk about a little bit about information retrieval with precision recall and the F measure, which are completely analogous to our old friends sensitivity and specificity. We're going to talk about sort of drop down into evidence-based medicine and how current processes work to synthesize the medical literature, come to consensus, get that published, get that into clinical guidelines, and then at the end describe some common challenges with respect to literature synthesis and application. So a long list of very broad stuff. So going ahead and starting. So if you want to interrogate the literature, folks that work in this area break out two main types of questions, and those are called background questions and foreground questions. So a background question is something that would be like in a medical textbook, just some general foundational background information. Foreground questions are things that would happen sort of at the sharp end where somebody's trying to do something. So for example, if a patient comes back to the ICU with an open abdomen, which level of sedation is better? You know, light sedation, deep sedation, who knows? You know, how much vasopressor, what type? So those kind of questions are foreground questions. And in some areas like ICU settings or surgery where it's really difficult to run randomized controlled trials that are blinded, there's a big sort of lack of evidence to support foreground questions. There's not a lot of randomized controlled trials that have been done, not a lot of evidence to support practice. So there are other methods where we might want to do this. For you guys that are going to take the human-computer interaction class, the project that class is going to go through is a project called Information at Your Fingertips, which is a way to, in ICU settings, provide a way for clinicians to interrogate the Clarity data warehouse and/or clinical data warehouse at the bedside. A lot of work left to do on it. It's very much in the pilot stages, but is all about bringing knowledge to the point of care for foreground questions for clinicians. So for foreground questions, they teach clinicians sort of a good way to conceptualize the questions and ask them, and it's all about different categories. So the mnemonic that they use is called PCOATS, and which is basically, it started out just as 4 categories, PICO, and then TS was added. So you might see it as PICO or PCOATS, same thing. So the P is patient or problem, how to describe that. The I is intervention. The C stands for what comparison of interventions do you want to make. O is the outcomes that you're measuring, and T is timing, and S is setting. So on the ICU Data at Your Fingertips project, we use 3 of these categories. We had our first category is how do you define the patient population at the point of care. The next was how do you define the intervention at the point of care. And the last was what outcomes are you interested in comparing the 2 or more interventions over. And we included timing and setting in the population definition. So we wanted people in the ICU, 24 hours post-op or whatever. And so this is in the ICU setting. You can imagine most of our questions that we wanted to ask when we analyzed them required us to program algorithms. 94% of them had data elements in the EHR to support answering the question, but it required, multiple lines of code to ask the question, which is difficult to do on the fly at the point of care. So that's what the project is about in human-computer interaction, is looking for clever cognitive ways to make those tasks available at the point of care at the bedside. And then, so when it has been, that project was done before in the mental health setting, it's a little bit easier. It was an electronic medical record that used ICD and DSM diagnoses, then the 2 were mapped. And they, at every visit, they captured something called CGI, which is a clinical global impression. So it's like the clinician's impression of how the patient's doing that visit. And then all of the therapies they were interested in were pharmacotherapies. So it's drug A versus drug B over patients with these diagnoses, maybe this gender and in this age group, or maybe a few more demographics, and then you compare them over the outcome of CGI. Really simple in that setting. ICU brings a ton of complexities to it. So we're investigating the feasibility of bringing a foreground type question answer system to clinicians in the ICU. So just an example of how and where PCOATS applies. When they do evidence-based medicine training for physicians, they train them on PCOATS, and thinking not that they're going to be, interrogating an EHR at the bedside, but thinking more that they're going to be interrogating PubMed and helping them to formulate their question to run the search over PubMed. So like what happens in PubMed, right? When you go out and look at the literature, a lot of people really don't think very deeply about this. You think, oh, it's the literature. But there's a lot of differences and variability in the literature, a ton. And so I just wanted to take the opportunity to talk about it a little bit with respect to new knowledge generation, meaning your dissertation projects. So sort of the penultimate type of article you'll find in the published literature is research results reported, where somebody's done an experiment that's capable of making an assessment of causality, and they've run the experiment to answer that question, that hypothesis of whether this causes this, and they've run a controlled study, and have an answer to that question. So when I say research results, that's what I mean, the experimental controlled research results. But people also publish review articles in the literature. You know, the area I work in, data quality, there was somebody that published a review article in 2010 looking at a review of all the work that had been done in data quality for performance measures. And so what they do is they go out and they get these articles from the literature and then they synthesize them in some way. And there are different levels of that, which we'll talk about. But there are also empirical or observational studies. People who haven't had coursework in research or experimental design tend to lump everything together as research, but that is not the case. An empirical or observational study is either something that's descriptive, as in like we looked at the data and we found these categories of events, or we found that the time scale of the events was this, or the average pain score was this. Something that describes what's going on in practice, but there's no comparison that's made. Or you could drop down and maybe do some comparisons, but in a completely observational setting, usually the most that you're going to be able to get is association or correlation. And how many of you guys have heard correlation should not imply cause? Okay, yeah, this is why. Because the design of it, without control in the study, you can't assess causality. It just can't be done. So a big rookie mistake that people make on papers is they'll write up an observational study or a correlative study, and they'll start talking about the conclusions as if they know something about causality. And that'll just cause people to reject the paper outright, boom, immediately. Bam, it's gone. The person's obviously clueless because they don't understand the difference between correlation and causality. So now that won't be any of us. Another type of study that people publish are case reports of some demonstration of something or some application of something. So this is, we implemented a new system and we used this process and this is how it went and what we learned. Or a clinical case report. Man, this dude came in with an aortic aneurysm and this is how we treated it and this is what we did and this is what happened. Especially in cases where the patient presentation is different, odd, or novel, or where the intervention that they used is different, odd, or novel. Those case reports, those little N of one, still might help another clinician. And so in the clinical literature you find those, but you also find them a lot in the informatics literature. For different processes or different systems that were evaluated. And so they can be evaluative, in which case it's good. It's applied research. It'll go in the published literature. You can also have some that are non-evaluative case reports, like they'll just describe this is what we did with no attempt to measure anything or provide any metrics. So that's why I grade those out, because those in perspective or opinion papers are really not, I'm not going to say they don't belong in the literature because that's way too strong. They're just very different from empirical studies or from controlled experiments that you'll find in the literature. And then the last are perspective and opinion articles. This is where somebody has no data or not much data. They're just writing up their perspective or opinion on something. And some of these are great. Like remember the fundamental theorem and the Tower of Achievement? Those were published as opinion papers. Chuck Friedman published them. He's one of the giants in the field. Okay, like we all care what Chuck thinks. And if Chuck has a new construct or framework, by God, I want it in literature because I want to know about it. And I want to know why I haven't seen one from him in the last few years, because I want some more of that good, solid thinking. So this only works really well, perspective and opinion articles, if you're already a thought leader in the field, is what I'm trying to say. We don't want opinion and perspective articles from people who are new in the field. It's valued very differently and most of the time not accepted in journals. So types of articles in the literature. So if you're working on a master's, you're going to be doing, maybe you can do empirical studies, you could do case reports or demonstrations. For working on your doctoral dissertation, your dissertation has to provide some new knowledge. It has to be some new method that you're testing, that you're evaluating. It has to be answering some scientific question. Is this better than this? If we do this, is it effective in practice? Those types of questions. So when you get pushback from your doctoral advisor about that's not a research question, what they're telling you is that you're sitting way lower on this hierarchy than you need to be sitting. Does that all make sense? Okay, so when you go to the literature and you look for stuff, this is an example of some articles I categorized when I was working on my dissertation way back when. And basically what it was about medical record abstraction and data error rates. And so I categorized them first, whether something was a controlled experiment or not. There were only 13 experimental studies in the literature out of this 150 articles. So that's telling me, wow, there's a lot of crap that's probably not going to help me very much. And then you know, after experiment, you might want to think, is it randomized? That tells you a little bit about the amount of control. You can get control from in quasi-experimental situations, but it's kind of a continuum, and you have to evaluate each one for the level, what they controlled for and how they controlled for it. There were, 64 of quasi-experimental studies. That means it's observational data, but they were able to get some type of control by how they designed the study or how they analyzed the data, or confounders they were able to collect data on and correct for in the analysis or whatever. And then there's non-experimental studies. There were 73 of them. These are just like the basic empirical studies. Boom, we looked at the data, and this is the error rate that we measured. It's interesting, it's nice. It's not really new knowledge. It tells me that they measured that error rate in that setting. Lovely. It's very, very hard to generalize up out of that. And then there's descriptive papers, meaning they actually calculated an error rate and described something like a case report, versus a prospective study where it was just somebody's opinion about medical record abstraction and data about it. So when you approach the literature for your research, you're going to find something similar. Jan just did this for his. He found about 30 relevant papers. I'm guessing of that 30 relevant that he found out of about, what, 1,000-ish, 800-ish? So he screened 1,500 articles, came up with 30 that were relevant for his research. And when he looks closer at those 30, he's going to have them in a tree, kind of like this. So of those 30, he's going to have, a handful of papers that are really relevant and informative for what he's doing. So when the first question people are going to ask when you do your research is, they're going to say, well, what does the literature say, and why is what you propose the next best thing to do? And this is your answer to that question when you do this, because this tells you what's already been done and how yours is supported by it, contraindicated by it maybe, or whatever the real situation is. So we want to get people, that's why I spend so much time in the literature in this lecture, because we want to get you, as you're considering doctoral projects, until you know the literature about the question that you're answering, you don't know this. And until you know this, you can't frame the next question, you as a budding researcher. Now you can go to your advisor and say, give me a project to do. And some advisors will do that. They'll give you a project and they'll say, here, run this, and that'll be your dissertation. That'll be lovely. But that doesn't develop you as a researcher, because you don't have to tangle with this. And as a researcher, I personally want you to struggle with this really, really hard, because that struggle is how you become a researcher. So enjoy the struggle. It really will look this bad. This is my actual example. So how does that stuff get in the scientific literature? Like when I go enjoy the fruits and the magic of PubMed and Medline, exactly how does it get there? I know Kat wishes I would stop enjoying the fruits of Medline. So let's talk a little bit about that. So I think, and this is my opinion only, I'm sure there's a better categorization. I think there's really two intellectual tasks with scientific information use. So there's indexing it in the literature, and there's the method to use to retrieve it from the literature. And we're going to talk about both of those, because there's open research questions in biomedical informatics. Like, I'm not just talking about this topic to help you get going on your dissertation over the holidays, but these indexing and retrieval are two very open areas of question in both biomedical informatics for the biomedical literature, as well as just in general information in library science for all of the knowledge that might need to be curated and retrieved. So first of all, let's talk about indexing. So there's a lot of stuff that's not indexed. And so how stuff gets indexed in Medline is there's a lovely group. You look at the NIH campus and you'll puzzle at the fact that the NIH building is kind of large for National Library of Medicine. One of the reasons it's large is because those people are the people that index Medline. So there's a group at National Library of Medicine called the Literature Selection Technical Review Committee, LSTRC. And whenever a journal would like to be indexed in Medline, they have to submit a lifelong application and request permission to be indexed, and they have to provide basically assurance that they can meet the technical requirements of sending the article citation stuff electronically to PubMed, or Medline, sorry. And also they have to meet the requirements of scientific rigor and quality of what's published in the journal. And the Literature Selection Technical Review Committee at NLM makes that decision. They meet a few times a year and review all the applications. So being indexed for academic retrieval is the sign of a real journal. If you get something in email that says, oh, you are a notable researcher in your field, please send me your publications to this journal, chances are you're going to look up the journal and it won't be indexed. So I'm going to exit and we're going to figure out how to look up Medline index journals. Let's see if I've got PubMed open somewhere. And I do not. If we go to PubMed, and I forget what the thing is that I look for. I think it's NLM catalog. Maybe I looked at the wrong thing. No, I think that is it. Maybe I just need these. Where was that page that popped? Oh, there it is. Okay. If somebody sees it on here before me, holler. I'm looking for the link for where we see the journals rather than the citations.
Is it on the right side?
Yeah, so that filters your search results. I don't remember anything. All right, let me go back here. Let me see if they might have a link. Oh, there we go. This is the NLM catalog. Okay, so if I search here, healthcare quality. Oh. Thank you. So this pulls up journals in healthcare quality that meet my exact text string. And if I take the quotes off and do it not exact, I get about 300. So these are journals. These aren't article citations in here. So if you get an email and you're concerned that it might be a predatory journal or a journal that's not indexed for academic retrieval, go here. That's the NLM catalog is right here.
You can add
currently indexed as a search term, and it will automatically apply that to your.
Oh, no way. That's awesome. That's really cool. So let me decode a little bit what Matt just said. So journals can be indexed for a time and not indexed for another time. They can get bad or they can get better and be indexed or whatever. So Matt's trick will only pull you search results when you're looking for articles for folks that are currently indexed. That's awesome. I didn't know that. Thank you. Way cool.
Can you, in the little search details there on the, you scroll down to the bottom to see if that's if it's approved yet? I'm just curious if they put it in.
NCBI journals. Okay, so when we say indexed in Medline, that's what we mean. That the publisher cares enough about the journal to make sure that it is available for the public for academic retrieval. If I'm not saying don't ever publish somewhere that's not indexed, like a lot of conference proceedings are not indexed in Medline. And there are some journals where it's a newer journal, and but if you think they're headed that way and they're going to be reputable, and then it's okay. But be careful for predatory journals, and that's how you find out. Not that if it's not indexed, it doesn't always equal predatory journal, but it's a much higher likelihood that you probably shouldn't publish there if it's not indexed for academic retrieval. So, and the reason is that there's really kind of a hierarchy, and the real reputable stuff is indexed for academic retrieval. And so that's kind of on the right-hand side of the spectrum. There's other types of things that might or might not be reputable, but that are not necessarily indexed for academic retrieval. So there's index literature, and then if you back up a little bit, there's conference proceedings. How many of you guys have put a conference paper in or published one? Some, okay, some, yeah. So conference papers might or might not be. We've all published there. We'll probably all continue to publish there. It's a great place for preliminary stuff and works in progress. And then you might back up a little bit more, and there's a gray literature, which includes anything, white papers, press releases, all sorts of stuff, and write-ups in newsletters or bulletins. There's all sorts of stuff in the gray literature, and they are not indexed for academic retrieval either. So if you want to search the literature that's indexed for academic retrieval, then you're going to search an index database like Medline. PubMed is the user interface for Medline. Embase is Medline for Europe. So those are both, that's pretty much the biomedical literature in the US and Europe if you search PubMed and Embase. Unfortunately, although this might have changed, we used to not have Embase access here. So if you need to search Embase, or if you're doing a systematic review or something for your doctoral work, come ask me. I keep a list of people that need Embase. I'm a editor for a standards thing that we have to do systematic literature reviews. So every few months I end up purchasing Embase access. So if you need to run an Embase query, get on the list to get in the group to get your thing executed over Embase while we're executing queries. ACM is also relevant to informatics. It stands for the Association of Computing Machinery. So folks that publish in the computer science literature, the IT literature, it's ACM. I don't know if that is the index database or the professional society. I think it's the latter, but they do index for academic retrieval, and they have their database available online to search. So if you're searching the index literature, you're going to be searching a database. And if you go to the UAMS library page, there is a ton of databases there. There's one specific to nursing and psychiatry, and there's probably 100, 150, I'm guessing, databases for academic retrieval on the UAMS library that you can do from the comfort of your own desk chair, wherever that may be. If you want to search the gray literature, I like Google Scholar for the gray literature. If you're doing a real hardcore systematic literature review, you probably want other ways to search other than just Google Scholar, and you would need to really find an expert in searching the gray literature. There are reasons for doing that. One of the things that we did recently is we published a systematic review of funders' requirements for data management plans for research studies. So man, all that's in the gray literature. It's on people's websites. It's in people's standard operating procedures. It's in grant solicitations. It's in crazy places. So we had to use a very different search strategy to do that kind of review and make it as systematic as we possibly could. So there are research librarians that specialize in retrieving stuff from the academically indexed literature. Is everybody good about that? Okay. Systematic reviews will also be indexed, usually. So a little bit about Medline and PubMed. Since National Library of Medicine is really the institute at NIH that covers biomedical informatics, we care greatly about it and what they think and where they're planning on going in the future. It's the National Library of Medicine folks that actually do the indexing for Medline. And they've been indexing the biomedical literature since 1879, which is like way cool. It's such a gift. It's such an amazing effort to be able to search the literature that somebody, I have no idea who, had the forethought to make it possible. Index Medicus was sort of the predecessor of Medline, in case you hear that term. Bless you. There are, at last time I checked, there were about 5,600 journals that were indexed in Medline. And then since 1996, it's been available online via PubMed. That's why I kind of call PubMed the user interface for Medline. And so what in the world do I mean by indexing, right? So when I talk about indexing, it means associating some metadata with the articles. And when you cite stuff on a paper, the citation, that's a lot of that metadata that occurs there. And so article metadata that Medline collects or uses in the indexing are on the left. Basic stuff, the journal, the title, languages, authors affiliation, the publication type. We'll talk about that in a few minutes. And any, like the medical subject headings, the MESH, when they say indexing, literally they mean, I kind of think of the term more broadly, but they mean attaching MESH terms to an article such that the search in PubMed will be facilitated. So with full text searching and text processing, you might think that the need isn't as high to rely on MESH terms. I've never compared them head to head. I don't know. It may be that there are text searching algorithms that can be better. Might be a good research question. But MESH headings are actually attached to the articles by the people at National Library of Medicine. And then there's a status tag that shows, because when a publisher publishes, when they send you the email that says, bam, accepted for publication, and they send you all your stuff and you do your proofs and everything. At some point soon after that, they publish it electronically early, and they'll send the electronic citation through to Medline. And so it will sit out there and available in PubMed immediately as soon as the publisher sends it. And then there's the people will get through it in time and actually do a formal indexing process. And you can tell from looking at the article. So when I say pulling up stuff in PubMed, this is the normal thing we all look at when we go search PubMed and see the abstract and a little bit of the, and so you can see some of the article metadata down here, like the PubMed ID is the purple one. Next to it's the PubMed Central ID. We'll talk a little bit about PubMed Central in a minute. The document identifier and all sorts of stuff. So what they do when they index, it's really straightforward. They review the article, and then they basically determine the content, and they attach a term out of a controlled terminology. At the first lecture, I think we talked a little bit about controlled terminologies. And so one important one is MESH, or medical subject headings. I'm not an expert on MESH, but I do think it was pretty much developed to index the medical literature, specifically for the purpose. I haven't seen anybody code any medical data with MESH subject headings. They would tend to code diagnoses with ICD or SNOMED or something like that. But their UMLS has on their website a MESH browser. Let's see if I can be more effective at finding the MESH browser. So some journals will, there it is. Some journals will actually require you to go to the mesh browser and search it. So here, it's on the web. If you have new terms, I actually have some for clinical data management that I need to submit to them and haven't submitted them yet. You can submit new terms. But say your poster is about, I don't know, let's say you're a clinician and you did the poster on diabetes. Why isn't it doing that? Oh. Huh, I can't make it work. Did I spell it wrong? Yeah.
An ATM situation?
No, I don't know. I've never had mesh not work. Usually you go here and it's really simple. You type in a term and it pulls it up. I'm not sure what I'm doing wrong. Yeah, man. Let's try the new one, Mesh on Demand.
I really like this because you can put a abstract in there, and automatically searches your entire abstract and spits out mesh headings for you.
That's advanced. That's way awesome. So you can kind of increase sensitivity and specificity potentially by using the full abstract. That's really cool. I am not where I think I am, clearly. Let me try it again. I think that's going to take me there, back there. All right, we were at Mesh on Demand, which didn't help. And I don't want an electronic copy of it, nor do I want to go through the RDF. And it came stuff, yeah, put stuff out. Yeah, they may have done an update or something. Yeah, okay, I'm not seeing it. I don't want to take up too much time in here. We won't get through the lecture. But usually if you go to the Mesh browser, so if I come around to grade your poster and you tell me you still couldn't search Mesh because it wouldn't do it, I guess I can't really count off for that if I can't search it either.
I was going to say, when I use mesh,
Yeah.
and I don't normally get a result back, I go up by concept. So if it was diabetes, I would then do disease, and then look at the tree, have the tree branch out, and then find the disease within the tree. But that's just how I use it. I don't know, it may be broken.
Yeah, I've never had it. You're right. You're usually able to look at the full tree and expand it. Yeah. That's not an NLM website. That won't take me anywhere special. And we've been here.
I just put in diabetes, and it came up with just the mesh term diabetes mellitus.
But it did something.
Select all fragments instead of exact match, then it pulls everything up, because then it has diet, pregnancy, diabetic foot, diabetic ketoacidosis.
All right, so it was a user problem. Okay, so I'm going back. All terms and all fragments. Yeah, this is not what I'm used to seeing. This is what y'all got?
Mhm.
You search the same place?
And if you click on one, it'll give you the tree.
Let me try it right here. There we go. Yay! Thank you, Matthew. All right, so if you go to, so evidently you have to put all fragments and all terms when you search. And when you click on one of the results to get to the tree. So this is what we're, and that's, so that will get you to the tree. Oh. There you go. I got too far down in the pregnancy tree. There we go, better. So you guys see what I did? That, okay. Even though I think all y'all found it before I did. So go and use the mesh browser and find the closest possible terms to your poster. I will warn you that there's not a lot of informatics terms in here, so you're going to experience a lack of coverage of a terminology source. If you are only coming up with the word database and that's the most relevant thing to your poster, then that's what you put. Don't spend 5 hours messing around with mesh. Get it as close as you can and bring it. Okay, so that is mesh, and that's the last lab. Okay, so now I want to kind of move on to the open access movement. So for the last 15 or probably more years, the philosophy that resources that are developed with public funds supporting research should be publicly available. And the OECD, the Organization for Economic Development, it's like an international kind of thing. I think 35 or more nations signed on to that sort of philosophy statement. Following that, NIH and NSF have policies now about data sharing. So now if your research, whether it was conducted like as part of something funded by your advisor, or whether you yourself got a small grant to do it like an F31, the data and the resources, there's going to be an expectation that they be made publicly available. And right now there is a difference, a gap between the expectation and the reality that your project officer will talk to you about or that your grant solicitation will require. So the NIH policy is that studies getting greater than $500,000 in direct cost in any year have to submit a data sharing plan. That doesn't mean you have to share it. That doesn't mean you have to put it on a website for everybody for free. It means that you have to have a plan for how you're going to give others access to the data, how they're going to request it, and how they're going to get that access, or how their request is going to be reviewed to make a decision about whether or not they can have access to that data. They're very understanding and cognizant of the fact that the researcher is not going to share data until after the primary manuscript's published. There are sort of timelines that go along with those expectations. So if it's a year or more since you finished the study and are still working on that publication, people are going to be less tolerant. And they're going to start considering you as not willing to share resources that were generated with public funds. So that's sort of today's climate, which overall is a very good thing, because it means that we might increase the return on investment for the money that was spent on generation of that research data. The other requirement that everybody needs to know about is that articles from NIH-funded research have to be submitted to PubMed Central within a year. So in other words, once it's published, you have a year to get it submitted in PubMed Central. And journals now are pretty, I mean, the policy has been out for a while, so journals are pretty understanding about it. But depending on where you publish, what their copyright agreement is, and they should all know about this by now. But Some journals will put it into PubMed Central for you. Those are the best kind. I like them. There is a process for you to manually upload it and put it in if you publish international journals. International journals generally are going to require you to go put it in PubMed Central. And because it's an international journal, you're going to need to check their copyright assignment policy and the publication agreement to make sure that you are not giving away the right to do that, because technically if you're funded with government funds, you can't give away the right to put the article there. In addition to the NIH requirements, there are also open access publishing models. One of the sort of earlier journals is called PLOS, the Public Online System or something like that. I forget what it stands for, but it was one of the early open public access journals, meaning that when you submit a paper, you pay some money. They don't charge subscription fees. That paper is available freely to everybody on the web. And so it's a flipped business model. It's completely different. Normally the journals recoup their money by subscription fees, maybe members from a professional society or through libraries. But in the open access model, like, there is no subscription, so how are the journals going to pay for all of the publishing that they do of those articles in the editorial process? And so in an open access model, there's a charge to publish. So, and you have to look at there are more shady open access journals than there are other journals. Reasonable charges are a few $100 per page for color charges. If it's a print journal, some people will charge color charges. For its open access on the web, there's often $1,000 or $2,000 for the actual fee to publish the article, which covers their editorial policies. There shouldn't be anything a lot greater than that, and there shouldn't be strings attached to it. Like, the publication fee should be assessed like when they publish the article. So if people want $2,000 for you to submit your journal and they're promising you they're going to accept it if you give them the $2,000, okay, that's not the way this is supposed to work. So you have to be on the lookout for those predatory policies. If they're guaranteeing you a review in a week and guaranteeing you publication and stuff like that, it's not a real peer-reviewed journal. So another part about the current climate that also has a lot of open research questions in it is in reproducibility of research. How many of you guys have heard about the Psychology Reproducibility Project? Okay, good, 2 people. Okay, so there's, I forget the name of the foundation. It was like on the tip of my head, and a colleague of mine got something funded through them. There's a foundation that provides money to reproduce research, sort of a watchdog group on science. And it's the Arnold Foundation is what it is. And I think they were the ones that funded the Psychology Research Project, Reproducibility Project. They actually will fund people to go out and take studies that have been done and measure the reproducibility and replicability of those projects. And so when they did this in psychology, they found some horrendous percentage, like half or something, of the research that was not reproducible. And so, like, exactly what do they mean by that? By not reproducible? Because that's like scientific method, right? We should all expect that every study can be reproduced and or replicated. So the first thing is sort of the difference between the definition of those words. So reproducibility has come to mean that the information is there to allow you to get the same results with the same data, processes, and computer code that the original researcher used. So this is a game changer, right? Because now you're not just publishing the paper in PubMed or in the journal and then it gets indexed in PubMed, but you're also making the computer code by which you produced it, your original data, and information documenting the data such that somebody not involved with the original study can go and use the data and replicate what you did. So the huge game changer and bar-raising event in science, that the tools for reproducibility are expected with the publication. Most journals now will allow you to submit supplementary materials. That's what they mean. That's data sets, and that's computer code and documentation of the data. There's still yet a different concept of replicability. And replicability is basically the ability to independently come to the same conclusions. So maybe you take somebody's protocol, maybe you just take their hypothesis, and you design a similar study, and you would expect to run it in a similar population if you want to be fair about the replication. But you basically design a new study to answer the same exact question in the same population, and you see if your study run by a completely independent team with de novo methods designed around that scientific question and de novo tools is going to give the same answer. And so often in stuff that's proposed to the Arnold Foundation now, people will propose two phases. They'll propose a reproducibility phase, just taking an area and looking to see which articles have materials publicly available without any assistance, just download them for reproducibility to support it, and which articles you have to ask the authors for or go through some data sharing request process. And of those, how many of them can actually produce it? So that's sort of one set of metrics for reproducibility. And then replicability, obviously it's a lot more expensive because it involves redoing the original study. And we have trouble funding research studies for the questions we want to answer, much less funding the second study to do it. So there's not a ton done in replicability, but it is done, and there are some people out there funding it. Often you can build replicability into a grant application for another question. When, for example, PCORI, for PCORI-funded investigators, the Patient-Centered Outcomes Research Institute, they require you to give them a budget of what it would take to share out your data and materials should another research team want to reproduce or replicate your study. And PCORI will go, they think they will go, I don't know if they have done it yet, but they have plans to go back and pick studies to replicate. And thus that budget would be enacted at that point in time. Huge game changer in science. When I started, this was nowhere to be found. It was, you do something responsible with your data, you save it in case somebody has questions, you document it appropriately, but you publish the paper and there it is. You might get a call years later, but rarely. Today, different game, which is really cool. And so this brings up a whole new topic. Aside from the fact that curation and retrieval and indexing are open areas of research and standards for doing that, the reproducibility and replication, there's a lot of scholarship going on in that area, as in what it takes to make research reproducibility and what can we do to automate data collection and management and metadata capture to facilitate research reproducibility for investigators. Those are all open questions. There's also open questions around research discoverability. And so for resource discoverability, I kind of think it goes down to two things. People that are experts in the field probably know a lot more about it, and they may categorize it differently. For me, it comes down to how much metadata are you going to use to describe your resource, and how close to reality can you get that description of that resource so that people searching for weird things can find it. So the study that we did about data management plan requirements from funders. Okay, that is a completely odd and different way that somebody would be searching to find those things, not the normal way. So, and there's no metadata on that kind of stuff to enable you to find it practically. But there are things like research data sets and other resources on the web that have metadata that are specifically there to enhance discoverability, meaning that somebody looking for data or looking for a resource like that will be able to find it. And then there's, of course, curation, which is the process of attaching that metadata, documenting it all, and attaching that metadata to the resource so that the resource can be discovered. So for a research study, curation and metadata, you might consider the research protocol metadata for the data. You might consider the data dictionary metadata for the data. You might consider computer code metadata for the data. You could also consider it a whole separate resource. So it's how are you going to do that? How are you going to specify all that? Open area for inquiry. in biomedical informatics and much broader. And I actually think the solution to some of these issues are going to come from the broader information science community, not necessarily just the biomedical informatics community, because this is a much broader problem across all scientific disciplines. So the last thing I'm going to talk about with respect to information retrieval are measures. The precision and recall are used. So in information retrieval and folks that develop Google searches and stuff like that, they don't talk about sensitivity and specificity like we would in the clinical community. They talk about precision and recall, similar calculations. They also use something called an F measure, which is basically a harmonic mean. F1 is the primary harmonic mean. It's not weighted. There are other measures like F2 or F half, and those are weighted differently, because you might want to, for different applications, you might want to weight precision recall differently. So like, for example, if you're developing a diagnostic test to be a screening test, then you want it to be really, really sensitive. You don't care so much how specific it is as long as it's reasonable. You just don't want to miss stuff when you screen people. So it's those kind of trade-offs that the different F measures allow you to make that take into consideration both of those. So information retrieval has these metrics. So now I'm going to kind of switch gears a little bit and talk about like what happens when you get the evidence. So you run a query, you get 100 articles or so, come back. You have to summarize the evidence. And this takes, the reason why I'm spending time on it now, because for your research, for your doctoral work or whatever research you're doing, you're going to have to do some work in the literature. This is going to take longer than you think to do this right. First one I did for my K award, my first really big one. For the K application, it took me months to write, and I thought I knew the literature really well. It took me months to get through it. Then I did a systematic review to identify research subjects that I was going to test in my K. It took me a year to get through the literature, to do the systematic review right, identify, get all the articles, and classify all the articles appropriately. So like, I'm not talking about a quick activity for synthesizing literature, and it's really, really serious business, because when you move forward as a scholar, you know that standing on the shoulders of giants things? Okay, this is it. The shoulders of the giants are what they have published in the literature. And if you don't know how to get that, understand it, and synthesize it well, and interpret what it tells you about what the appropriate next question is, then you're standing on a house of cards. So a good doctoral advisor will push back on you over and over and over and over again to make sure that you're on solid foundation for your research project. So that's why we synthesize the evidence. We have to demonstrate our understanding prior to doing new work, or should. The studies that are in the literature, just based on the diagram I showed you, the little tree from my doctoral work, man, the literature is filled with stuff, and a lot of it's crap. And a lot of it is not very useful for the question you want to answer. And so there's got to be a process of kind of weeding through that and sorting out prior studies with equivocal results, prior studies that left unanswered questions versus prior studies that demonstrated and laid down new knowledge upon which you should build rather than recreate the wheel. There's also the primary versus secondary literature. A lot of stuff in the gray literature, secondary literature, not all of it, but a lot of it is. Have y'all heard of SPIDES? Okay, so I'm gonna tell y'all a quick story. So, I do data quality research. So SPIDES is like the most famous story about data quality. It's called the Popeye spinach data error story. So you've all heard, eat your spinach, it has higher iron content, right? Mm-hmm. Okay, that's completely false. The original, it goes back, when you trace it all the way back to the primary research, it wasn't me that did this, this is a published story. When you trace it back, the person that compared the data for dry spinach versus wet leafy spinach. That and the weight's different. So when you get the iron content, it's different. So And that was used and used and used, and it was said that Popeye ate spinach because of the high iron content. Okay, not necessarily the case. And people referenced it and referenced it and referenced it and referenced it without ever going back to the primary literature. Okay, don't let that be you. If somebody says in a paper, such and such reported that A was greater than B, okay, you can't reference the paper that had that statement in it. You have to go back to such and such's paper and find where they said that A was greater than B and how they knew that and how they demonstrated that and reference that paper. Thus, the year to wade back through the literature, because you start reading papers and they start talking about stuff and referencing other stuff, and then you start tracing it back to the primary source. So primary versus secondary is just as important as what type of article it is and where you're getting it. And when you reference literature for your doctoral research, you're talking about knowledge that other people have generated. In other words, that needs to come from the results or the conclusions section of their paper. If they say a bunch of stuff that's going to help you make your case in the introduction, okay, that does not count. That's not primary. That's either opinion or it's not primary literature. So when you're writing a grant application, you will get kicked out very quickly if in that first paragraph of your aims page, the first paragraph of the application, you're justifying the need and the social or public health impact of what you want to study. That's got to be hard-hitting. It's got to come from the primary literature, and it has to be hard numbers. You can't have references in there from something somebody said in their introduction that it was an important problem. So it's going back to the primary research results. So that's why, as a researcher, we do it. There are also very valid reasons to do it for clinical issues. So, for example, if you want to know our open abdomen question in the ICU, do they need deep or light sedation? What's better? There's going to be, in the ICU, maybe not many, but there may be more studies out there. The studies are going to vary in size. They're going to vary in population. They're going to vary in where they were done in time. They're going to vary with respect to control groups. It is hard to get a daggone consistent answer out of a bunch of studies. If you're lucky and you're synthesizing literature and it's a clinical question, you might go back and there might be 10 or 20 real relevant studies that were done, all research results generating new knowledge. So you need a way to synthesize them. And what that requires is basically these steps at the bottom: finding all the relevant studies systematically, bringing them all together, having a systematic approach to synthesize the information in them, and then making some action recommendations out of them. So this is a pretty long, protracted process, because first, when you bring them all together to be systematic, you have to search multiple databases. Go to PubMed and do one search, and it's not considered systematic. So when you go to different databases, guess what? You get duplicates. CAT, how long does it take to combine research results from different databases into a distinct list? A lot.
It can, depending on how big each of your queries are.
A lot.
It can take weeks, days. I mean, I've had to redo big queries,
Yeah.
and what previously took me 3 weeks and it takes about 4 days. And you will actually find duplications in the same query too. Yeah,
and so I think Melody Penning's doing a systematic literature review in healthcare data warehousing.
Hers should be pretty deduced. I scrubbed it at least twice, but I mean, it's when you get the tricky part is when you get a situation where a article or something has been indexed by multiple primary authors. That's where you start to run into some issues.
And then the indexing is human. So there you do find
the human component.
And then you find scoundrels that publish the same article in 2 different places.
Yes, a couple of those we found.
Yep. So just getting the distinct list of articles you need to screen is intense. And then you have to synthesize them. So you have to figure out, what pieces of information do I care about from the articles? If it's a clinical review, it's practice recommendations that you care about, usually practice recommendations for treatment of a certain disease or condition or whatever. And then you have to recommend up actions out of that. And so when you approach the literature, like based on that tree that we showed earlier, there's all sorts of different levels of evidence. So individual studies would kind of be at the bottom. Observational studies, correlative studies down at the bottom. Often opinion doesn't make it onto the triangle, although there are some evidence grading schemes and some clinical guidelines that do recognize and publish opinion. Then there's synopsis of studies, synthesis of studies, synopsis of synthesis. I didn't know they occurred till I came across this diagram. And then summaries, and then actually putting the recommendations in a system. So for those of you on the clinical side, this is getting clinical practice guidelines that say if people have hypertension measured in this way, then they have to be on an antihypertensive. And when you program that into a clinical decision support system, into an EHR as a clinical decision support alert, that's what the systems thing is at the top, meaning that you've taken the various reports in the literature, you've come to conclusion with experts about exactly what the practice recommendation should be, what the best evidence is. You've taken that best evidence and operationalized it, standardized it as a decision support so that in clinical practice it'll be done the same way each time. So that's sort of what that means. And then Bill Hirsch, I'm sorry this is so blurry, but I ripped this off. And so it's just blurry, but I wanted to show it to you because I think it's some nice independent thinking of Bill's, and it's real specific to biomedical informatics. And so he's got individual studies at the bottom, Medline, index, journal articles. Notice he starts there. He doesn't start with ones that aren't indexed. Then there's synthesis and systematic reviews. Synopses you might find in textbooks or guidelines that have been processed even more than synthesis, and then putting it into systems. So it's sort of another view on it. When you read clinical guidelines, you'll see that they grade out the evidence. So Sackett is sort of in epidemiology, sort of a god, one of the earliest, bestest textbooks. And so this is Sackett's levels of evidence grading scheme. So case studies with no controls at the bottom, like we discussed. Studies with historical controls or case control next, and then on up. Better, more control, getting from associations and correlations up to causality. So randomized clinical trials being causal. So in order to do that, right, that people do that in clinical guidelines, they get in clinical guidelines because somebody's done the systematic review of the literature. There are guidelines for doing a systematic review. They're called PRISMA guidelines. So it's you should definitely do something systematic for your doctoral work to look at the previous literature. Whether you want to publish a systematic review is a whole different story. It might or might not be a good thing. It's a discussion for you and your advisor. But when you do that, this is how PRISMA conceptualizes it. So first you're going to identify the articles in multiple databases systematically using the similar queries as possible, but they're not exactly completely similar because the databases are just different. Then there's screening the articles. When we do systematic literature reviews, we have 2 independent people screen the abstracts and title and make a decision based on standard inclusion-exclusion criteria about whether an article is relevant or not. This is the process that Cochrane uses. It's the process that we use for the clinical data management practices when we screen articles. So after 2 independent people review, they agree sometimes they don't. There has to be a process for adjudicating when they disagree and making that decision. And then for the articles that are included, so for this round of the last 10 chapters updated for the clinical data management practices document, the practice standard, we screened over 8,000 articles, 8,690 some. The most of which CAT actually integrated. And then in doing that, for each of the 10 chapters, each of the chapters had anywhere between 15 and 50-ish articles that were relevant and included.
The large one was the 3 that we
Yep.
That was the one that had the most.
Yep.
The
And
detractors.
and so again, that back to that tree. That's what you're going to find. So then for those articles that meet the eligibility criterion for the double abstract review, you pull the full article. Then 2 independent people read the full article. Now this is where it gets really tough. Okay, this is why this took me a year. Because after I got my 100 articles, first of all, 100 was too many, but I got them anyway. I started reading them, and I enjoyed reading them. And I was reading and highlighting and taking notes and reading and highlighting and taking notes. The problem is by the time I got to the 30th article, I couldn't remember crap from the first one. Not only that, but I had a growing list of other articles that I needed that were primary articles referenced by those 30 articles. So in order to do systematic literature review, when you start out doing it, you need to come to a decision with your advisor about what it is from the articles you want to collect. So you make yourself a little data collection form, and you put that information on that data collection form. Other way you could do it is you could load them all up into a qualitative analysis software like NVivo and code actual passages from the articles. I love the use of NVivo and Atlas and things like that for systematic literature reviews, because it's on the original article, and you can trace back from the code that you applied or the set it becomes a member of by virtue of your coding back to the original article. But you have to have 2 people doing that and 2 people identifying what's important in the articles. But that's based on your research question. And so you have to play around in the literature a little first and see if you can come up with maybe some of the seminal articles or maybe 4 or 5 articles that you think are really good to get a feel for what's going to be there before you can even make the data collection form that you're going to write down. Because in the paper, you're going to want to say something about your review. You're going to say, well, this % were empirical studies versus, controlled experiments, or some other statement. This % were done in academic medical centers. This % were done in for-profit facilities. This % were U.S. versus international. This % was done on this population. This % was done on that population. This % of the people just did a demonstration project, and this % of the people did a demonstration project and evaluated it, versus this % of the people did something more formal and controlled, or whatever the statement is. You need to know those up front. Prisma has, and then after you review all the articles twice and do your little data collection form, you will have again applied your inclusion exclusion criterion, because for some of them you'll think it's good and then you'll pull the article and it won't be valid. It won't meet the inclusion criteria. So you can still exclude them. So this is when you publish a systematic literature review, like this flowchart has to be there. This has to be a figure in the paper. So when you propose your doctoral stuff, if I'm sitting out there, I'm going to ask you for your flowchart, because I want to know what literature you got through and how you got through it, and what you surmised from that experience and how that informs the question you're going to ask. There's also a checklist. If you do end up wanting to publish that, sometimes you just need to do it enough to know the literature, to have this diagram and to know the literature enough to ask your next question. You don't need to go forward and publish systematic review. If a systematic review in your area hasn't been done, you could be the seminal paper in that area by publishing it. So sometimes it's worth taking the extra few months to write it up and publish it. Your decision. Prisma has a checklist. The publishers, if you check, boom, this article is a systematic review, they're going to ask you for your Prisma checklist. Another similar approach is doing a Cochrane review. Not all types of reviews are created equal. There's a systematic review, but there's other types of reviews that actually do pooled analysis or do meta-analysis from the research result. Pooled analysis is actually including going back, getting the raw data, and combining that. Meta-analysis is just comparing them based on their results. That's the little Cochrane logo. So really what that thing is basically it represents an odds ratio. And so the line down, that purple line that's going down the middle, is odds ratio of 1, or weighted mean difference of 0, weighted means for continuous data. Then if they're all on the left, that means some treatment benefit. You really don't want them to cross the line. It means you're not quite sure about treatment. So that's where they get their logo from. So when they say meta-analysis, that's what they mean. They're comparing papers in the literature based on their results. So when something gets into clinical guidelines, A systematic review is good enough to get it in there. If there's only one study that's been done on it, kind of hard to base a practice recommendation on one study. So they'll do that, and then they'll apply the SACIT or whatever guideline evidence grading criteria so that readers will know this is based on a whole Cochrane review of 30 randomized controlled trials, and we're certain this is the best way to treat this, versus somebody did a study and we're kind of not sure, but the study showed that it could be positive. So a clinician's going to treat those differently. So there's this whole kind of this spectrum of reviews that you do or could do. This is just a little bit more information about the Cochrane stuff. So clinical guidelines are great. I can't think of any that are not really based on review, but they're not a one size fits all. So by like extolling the virtue of Cochrane reviews and whatever, I don't want you to think that clinical guidelines are the end all be all. Sort of as the zenith or the point, the top little point of the evidence-based medicine hierarchy. They really don't work for some patients. If it says if you have a CHF patient, treat them like this, but if you've got a CHF patient that's near renal failure, you're probably going to treat them a little differently. If they start having fluid problems. So not adequate for all patients. So it doesn't take away the thinking from the physician. Guidelines they're always incomplete usually. They can be inaccurate if the research is equivocal or people haven't, or if the state of science isn't, might find something new or learn something new. There might not be enough information in the medical literature in order to make a treatment algorithm for it, in which case the literature is kind of useless. And the last one is kind of different, but really important. You really care that the guidelines are produced by independent groups. That in other words, you don't want the guidelines for treatment of major depressive disorder to be written by the pharmaceutical industry, because they're going to think they have a hammer and they want everyone to prescribe antidepressants. And so for guidelines, professional societies that do them really usually have very strict rules about conflict of interest and relationships with industry for them. I've worked with some clinicians that because they were funded by a pharmaceutical company to be a PI or a site in clinical trials, their professional society would not let them sit on guideline committees because of the relations with industry. But you need to check, because not all guideline makers are created equal and they all have different policies and procedures. And so Institute of Medicine in 2011 came out with this thing called Guidelines We Can Trust. They list these things, these attributes of good guidelines. And there are places to find general good guidelines. National Guidelines Clearinghouse is pretty good. I haven't looked at GIN, but people list it, other people use it. But nothing substitutes from really looking at the actual guideline. And the last kind of problem that I'll bring up with guidelines is that, as we talked about earlier, like Arden, why we have Arden syntax is to try to make this interchangeable, but we have the curly braces problem, so it's not interchangeable. Lucilla Ono Mikado, she's actually, I think, the current editor of JAMIA, the chief editor, did her work in the guideline interchange format. And so tried to come up with a way to share computable guideline information to make guideline algorithms interoperable, so that, as happened during the semester when the hypertension guidelines changed, boom, it would be lovely if we could just email everybody out the new rule and have them install it, and it wouldn't be a problem. But it doesn't work that way, even through some really valiant attempts. This is only one of them. There are other attempts to standardize and make clinical guidelines interoperable. But they are still not. Thus, every institution has to have physician builders to take those algorithms in the new guidelines and write the algorithms into the Epic EHR or whatever EHR they're using. And any institution, they might have thousands of rules that they manage in that way. Okay, any questions? I know that was a little bit of a fire hose, but it was more important to get all the concepts out than it was to delve really deeply. So last day of class, December 5th, I will come ready to answer lots of questions. So bring your bestest and brightest questions.
Be prepared to do some Bayes problems. That's one big thing. Is that.
Bayes problems. We might have to make a Bayes study group if we don't want to spend the whole time on Bayes.
No, obviously.
Okay.
But like, yeah.
But that's the area, okay. So bring your questions. You guys are going to bring the content. I'm not coming with a prepared lecture. I'm coming with my copy of the book if I can find it. It's disappeared.
I have a digital copy.
That I might need you to do that.
You haven't gotten it already?
I thought
You should get that already.
Summer has it.
Yeah.
Oh, I don't have it. I don't have it. That's all right. But come with your questions. I'm going to come with my book and my computer and my brain, and hopefully we'll get a good night's sleep the night before, and we can. Sally knows better. She's like, no, you won't. So we can have a lovely question answer session. So what's this? Okay, the poster session. Don't forget about the poster session, December 8th.
What do we need to do? Do we need to register with Deborah or somebody or Summer to make sure where our spot is, or are you guys gonna number off boards and assign us a number?
You know what? I have absolutely no idea. I will ask and figure out. Deborah did ask me the other day how many people. I said, well, there's about this many in the intro class, and I think there's only 2 groups that might be working together.
Well, and, Dr. Tarbox in our lab rotation class is giving us the option of either a poster session, or a presentation that may or may not be done next week. Only some of us have gotten information about that, and some of us haven't. I know our group, just in case, we're gonna print out a poster if that's gonna be easier. So placement,
I would do a poster.
Well, so placement for us is key because Matt and I are in a group together. Matt, Caleb, and I are in a group together for the lab class, and then Caleb and Bissing are in a group together.
Maybe. I'm still trying to figure out the whole time.
Okay.
Well,
So don't.
You see what I mean? Like placement is key.
Yeah. So don't worry about the placement or the formality of it. I will come around and grade posters. If you're not there, like I'll try to find out where you are, because I do know a lot of you have other posters and stuff, so I will make an attempt to find you. If I can't find you, then your poster should speak for itself. I will grade that. You don't have to be there to present it. I'm not going to grade you on your presentation. I'm grading you on what you've got on the poster. Did you meet the criterion that we?
In theory, if you're choosing to do a poster for Dr. Tarbox.
Yeah, you could have 2 posters in it. Yeah.
So if we're not able to stay the whole time, it's okay if we've already gotten I have a class at
Yeah.
2.
Okay, that's fine.
Across campus, so.
That's fine.
Okay.
So I think it'll be here in the hall. I think so. We'll all be kind of in there together. Yes.
The practice exams by the 4th of the year, is that when you're referring to?
Yes. So I will try to have your practice exam posted by midnight Monday.
We can have it done before Tuesday's class.
Yep. That way you can have, if you want to try to get it done before Tuesday's class, you can do that. If you'd rather not, that's okay. Either way is completely fine. And then for the final exam, it will open at 12 a.m. first minute of the morning on December 14th, because it'll be automatic through Blackboard, and it'll close at 11:59. Open note, open book, open web, closed human, except for yourself. You guys good?
Have you figured out how long you're gonna give us for it?
I have not, because I don't know how many questions it's going to be.
Okay.
And I don't want to tell you, oh, it's only going to be 30, and then me get headlong into it this weekend and realize it is completely impossible to reasonably cover the material in 30 questions, and I needed 40.
I think we're all probably mentally prepping for 45 to 50, especially since we're not doing a quiz for this week.
Yeah.
And that's anywhere from 5 to 10 questions.
Yeah, so I'm not being like, I'm really not trying to be tricky. It's just that I won't know what's an accurate time until I know how many questions are on it. and what type of questions are on it.
Well, the other question that came out.
Can we formally request that the questions do not have the time limit per question, but rather it's for the whole exam, so that you.
Oh, sure. Yeah, that'll be fine.
5 minutes a question, that way you've got time, some of the questions will be, it'll take you,
Yeah.
30 seconds to do, and some of them might take 10 minutes. That way we don't get a situation where like some of the first quiz questions where you get locked out of the quiz question if you took too long because.
Did that happen on the first quiz?
It was one of the quiz.
It was like,
Really?
It was the first or second quiz, the way it was initially set up at first.
Uh-huh.
It was one that you pull down and then re-put back up.
Okay, I wonder what in the world I did.
Each question was timed, and I got kicked out at least one.
Okay.
But then it was one that you pull down and then re-uploaded, so it didn't matter.
Okay, if something like that, that is not what's intended with
Okay.
it. If something like that happens, contact Tremaine. I will be, I will probably be on a plane.
Not like you right now because you're dropping a final and then filling out
I know.
papers.
Yeah, and I hate to do that, but if something is broken with the final, Tremaine will be able to fix it, and I very much trust his judgment to do that.
Are you still intending to use the online proctoring?
Mhm.
So, we need to make sure our webcams are uncovered.
Yep. Yes, take your. Hmm?
We have to go to one session also.
Yep.
Take it and return again.
One session. Got to do it one session. I heard a ding. Hang on, let me go check for questions. Okay, hang on, question. I'm coming to get to you.
So, something photo.
Thank you, Hoda. Okay. In any other questions?
Oh, there's a real
Oh.
question.
Mitra. Okay, hang on. Where? Oh, there. I see. How long the question? So Mitra, I do not know because I haven't written the exam yet, and I'm going to base the time on the number of questions and the type of questions that I have on there. So like if a question would require you to read a passage and draw a flow chart, I'm going to have to give you longer for that kind of thing, or a Bayes problem. But as soon as when I post the practice test Monday, I will have written the real exam and the practice exam, and I'll be able to tell you how many questions and how long. Okay? So I promise I will be able to tell you that soon. I just don't want to give any misinformation or be locked into making a less than kind of good exam. Okay, I want to ask one final question. How many of you guys have published something this semester? Submitted, gotten published? Yeah, submitted. Ha! 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Yay! Jan, you didn't raise your hand. You published this semester? All right.
It was quick.
How many of you guys thought that would happen? You were obligated, Miriam. Yeah, so congratulations, guys. I mean, it's really hard to work and go to school and do class work and get some academic productivity. So I'm really proud of the stuff that you guys have done, and I know that you guys will continue to be proud of the stuff that you guys have done. So it's awesome to look at so many people that have published this semester. Have a good night, guys. Okay, Mitra, Hoda, Michael, have a good night.